our anatomy and our physiology is completely different from that of meat eaters. So there's really nothing that supports the idea that human beings should be consuming animal tissue. The more meat people eat, the higher their risk of heart disease, the higher their risk of cancer, the higher their risk of kidney disease. So elephants don't eat elephant tissue to build muscle. They don't eat eggs to build muscle, yet they're the biggest, strongest land animals on the planet. If you look worldwide, those nations that consume the most dairy foods also have the highest incidence of osteoporosis. Dairy is the most unnatural foods that human beings consume. Drinking milk for the nutrients is like inhaling cigarette smoke for the oxygen. It's all marketing. They recommend dairy because the dairy lobby lobbies them to encourage it.
Hello, Dr. Milton Mills. Thank you for another interview. I really appreciate it. We at Plant-Based News really appreciate it. You're obviously an expert in the field of evolution and anatomy, especially in the context of what we're designed to eat. And I wanted to first up get your thoughts on the ketogenic diet, which is a massive craze at the moment.
Well, unfortunately, I think one of the reasons that the ketogenic fad has taken off is just that. It's the current fad. It's the current thing that people are doing. Now, it's true that when people use these ketogenic diets, that they will lose some weight. But that's really not the only question or issue that people need to address. The better question is, what are you doing to your body in the process? Because, I mean, if you just want to lose weight, you can become a meth addict and lose weight, but that's not healthy. And neither is going into ketosis, because essentially what that's doing is putting your body on a starvation mode, and it's ramping up the amount of circulating fat in your system, and ultimately it's been shown to injure your blood vessels and create lesions that can ultimately develop into heart disease, and over the long term we believe it elevates cancer risk. So it's just not healthy. And there are better and healthier ways to try and lose weight. And the best way, of course, is to eat a diet that does not promote excess weight gain, like a vegan diet, a healthy vegan diet.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's sort of like a lot of passionate medical doctors that recommend the opposite to you. They sort of recommend a ketogenic low carb diet. And there's certainly like a belief in the mainstream that we're designed to eat meat. Do they have any kind of credible arguments? What's their best argument?
To be quite honest, I haven't heard anything that I would consider to be a good argument that humans are designed to eat meat, because we're not. I mean, our anatomy and our physiology is completely different from that of meat eaters. So there's really nothing that supports the idea that human beings should be consuming animal tissue. Nothing.
But why does the mainstream think the opposite?
Because people are addicted.
Why are they addicted though? Why does the mainstream think we need animal tissue?
It's simply a cultural phenomenon. This is the way people were raised. This is what they were taught, and they accept it without questioning it. Even though we know that the more meat people eat, the higher their risk of heart disease, the higher their risk of cancer, the higher their risk of kidney disease, the higher their risk of diabetes, people still think, oh, I need this stuff. But if they would step back and look, they would see that the more meat and dairy they eat, the higher their risk and incidence of all of these chronic diseases. And that is telling you right off the top, we should not be eating these things. It's not healthy, and it's not good for us.
I'm going to play devil's advocate and ask some things related to what the public believe. There's like a common opinion that we sort of need animal protein. What does the science say?
Every study that has looked at animal protein in humans has shown that any exposure to animal protein correlates with increased disease risk. Now, does that mean that if you eat an egg, once, that is going to kill you? No. But what it does mean is that if you do that habitually, it will ultimately lead to disease, because animal protein in and of itself is toxic to the human organism. It is not the type of protein we should be ingesting. It harms our blood vessels, it harms our kidneys, and it promotes cancer in humans. And it is much healthier for us to get our protein from plant sources.
You mentioned eggs a minute ago. A lot of people say eggs are the perfect protein. What's your take on that statement?
Well, actually, eggs, I was just at a conference where several researchers presented some very compelling data that showed that habitual consumption of eggs promotes prostate cancer and a number of other health problems. So eggs are not healthy. They're animal protein. And they will increase your levels of something called insulin-like growth factor 1. And we know that the higher your level of IGF-1, the higher your risk of developing cancer. So it should be avoided. Now, where did this idea that egg was a perfect protein come from? Well, it came from back in the early days of nutrition research, when researchers said, well, if you look at egg protein, it has an amino acid composition that's very close to human tissue. And on that basis, they felt that it was, quote, the perfect protein. But that's really silly, because you don't need to eat protein that is similar to your tissue in order to build tissue. I mean, you look at the biggest, strongest animals on the planet, they're all plant eaters. So elephants don't eat elephant tissue to build muscle. They don't eat eggs to build muscle, yet they're the biggest, strongest land animals on the planet. So you don't need to eat animal protein to build animal tissue. That's just a ridiculous misconception.
And what's your take on omega-3s? Does this mean we need to eat fish?
Again, it's amazing how our dysfunctional diets are built on this mountain of nutrition misinformation. And one of the major points of misinformation is the idea that that omega-3s are fish oils. First of all, these oils are not made by the fish. They're actually made by marine plants, algae, and they are they accumulate in the fish's body as there are animals that eat the algae, and then there are other animals that eat those animals, and then the bigger fish come along and eat those animals, and they slowly concentrate these omega-3 plant fats in their tissues. But along the way, they also accumulate a number of toxins like PCBs, dioxins, mercury, and actually fish oils are some of the most toxic materials you can consume, and they're also not necessary. There are plenty of plant sources of omega-3 fatty acids, such as green leafy vegetables, walnuts, beans, soybeans, and so forth. And if you are eating a diet that is low in fat, your body will take those plant sources of omega-3, which typically come as 18 carbon omega-3 fatty acids, and our bodies are perfectly capable of elongating those 18 carbon omega-3 acids into the EPA and DHA that we need for brain function and that women need to transfer to their infants via their breast milk.
But Milton, Dr. Mills, look at these canines. These mean we're designed to eat meat, right?
Yeah, I mean, humans have very small canines that over time have become small and rounded and function like accessory incisors. They're utterly useless for trying to rip and tear anything other than an envelope. They're useless for eating animal tissue. And in fact, the ear, nose, and throat medical literature shows that every year, 90% of the people who choke to death trying to eat meat.
And what's your take on the B12 issue? A lot of people use that point to support the argument that we're designed to eat meat. They say vegans need to supplement with B12 and people that eat meat don't. Like, what's your take on that?
Again, this is what goes back to what I was saying about our dysfunctional diets being built on a mountain of nutrition misinformation. First of all, B12 is not made by any animal. All B12 is made by bacteria. And if humans were living in natural settings, we would get B12 from the environment. We'd get it from the soil. We'd get it from the water that we drink. It would be everywhere because bacteria are everywhere. But because we now live in these modern, concrete, sterilized cities that we've built for ourselves, we've eliminated a lot of the natural sources of B12. And it's true that in the typical Western diet, the usual sources of B12 are animal foods. But even then, when you look at the B12 status of people that eat meat, most of them are marginal. So B12, again, animal foods are not the best sources. They're not the only sources. And even those animals got their B12 originally from the bacteria, and we can do the same thing. We can take a supplement and get our B12 that way, since we can't get it from the environment because we live in cities.
Let's talk about the fact that humans' eyes are at the front of their heads. Often people say because of that, it means that it's indicative of the fact that we're designed to eat meat. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, so there's this question of binocular vision and whether or not that means that an animal is a hunter. And again, no, that's again, misinformation. The purpose of binocular vision is to give you good depth perception. Depth perception is used for a variety of different things. In humans, we needed depth perception because we are bipedal, and our ability to stand upright largely depends on our ability to take visual cues from our environment and to navigate the terrain by, again, having good depth perception. And also the fact that because most primates started off as arboreal creatures, meaning creatures that were living in trees, you've got to have good depth perception in order to move from one branch to the other. But you look at kangaroos. Kangaroos are also bipedal mammals that have forward-facing eyes and good depth perception, because if you're going to be standing on two legs, you need that. So that does not mean in any sense that just because you have good depth perception that you're supposed to hunt. That's like saying that an eagle has wings, and therefore, since a hummingbird has wings, it also is meant to be a raptor. I mean, it's silly. Yes, they both have wings, but they use their wings for different things. We have good depth perception, but we use it for very different purposes from carnivores. And when you actually look at carnivore eyes compared to human eyes, they're structured very differently. Human beings have mainly cone photoreceptors for good color vision and detail vision. Carnivores have mainly rod photoreceptors. Human beings have what's called a fovea, meaning that our area of most detailed vision is in a pit at the back of the retina. Carnivores don't have fovea. They have what's called a linear streak, where their best visual perception runs along a strip that runs at the back of their retina, and anything moving across that strip will stimulate them to into a chase pursuit behavior. And so again, they have binocular vision, but they use it very differently from the way we use ours.
There's obviously a lot of information that supports the idea that we're, not designed to eat meat. Much of what you've just said supports that. But I'm just wondering whether there's anything else you haven't said that supports the idea we're meant to eat exclusively plants. And if you could just sum up those arguments in a minute or two, that would be really helpful for like a standalone video.
Number one, our jaw structure, which we have the jaw structure of an herbivore. That is to say, we have a jaw joint that is placed above the plane of the cheek teeth. Evolutionary theorists theorize that this type of jaw structure was so important to processing plant foods that it evolved independently 15 different times during mammalian evolution. And so this type of jaw structure is only found in animals that have committed to a plant-based diet, because it's a very mobile type of jaw joint, but it's also very weak, meaning that if you try to eat something that is hard or difficult, you run the risk of dislocating your jaw, which of course would result in starvation out in the wild. We have the intestinal structure, again, of an herbivore, meaning that our intestines are 10 to 11 times our body length, which is what's necessary to process plant foods because of all the fiber that's in them. And once again, that's very different from animals that are designed to eat meat. We have a relatively small stomach that does not allow us to consume enough calories at a single meal to last us a whole day. Like all herbivores, we are batch feeders, meaning we have to eat multiple times a day in order to get enough calories to last us even a single day. Now, that's very different from meat eaters that can eat once every 7 to 10 days and they're perfectly fine, but that's because they have much larger stomachs than the plant eaters. And then when you look at our large intestine is designed to process plant fiber. It has what's called a pouch or sacculated appearance. It's very long relative to our body size, and it houses a microbiome or bacterial population that's designed to break down plant fiber into things like short-chain fatty acids and other compounds that we can extract additional energy and nutritional value from. So again, from start to finish, we are clearly herbivores. And then when you actually look at the compounds that are found in things like cruciferous vegetables, it turns out that those compounds actually interact with receptors on our intestinal cells to actually ramp up our immune function and help program our immune cells so that our immune system functions better. So in so many different ways, we are utterly dependent on plant foods to be completely healthy. And when those things are missing from our diet, our physiology goes off track, and ultimately it results in disease.
Coming to the end now, I just want to ask a couple of other questions. I'm interested to know what your take is and whether you give any credibility to the ideas and opinions of people like Michael Pollan, who believe that we should eat predominantly plants, but from a health point of view, it's okay to have a little bit of meat because we've sort of evolved to eat meat. What's your take on that?
Well, again, there is no evidence that we evolved to even eat a little bit of meat. And you can look at the human consumption of dairy foods to get an idea that this is not true. The practice of using the milk of cows or goats or sheep for food is probably somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000 years of existence in human cultures. And within that very short window of time, for those societies that became dependent on the use of dairy foods, it's selected for individuals who were called lactase persisters. In other words, these are people who continue to make the enzyme lactase throughout their adult life, whereas in probably 99% of all mammals, once a mammal is weaned, its body stops making the enzyme lactase because you're not going to be exposed to the lactose, which is the sugar in milk. But again, within just a period of 3,000 to 5,000 years, for those societies that use dairy foods, it's selected for the majority of the population being able to continue to digest dairy foods. Now, it still causes disease in them, but they are at least able to digest it. Well, you don't find any corresponding adaptation to the ingestion of animal protein. As I said before, the study showed that any exposure to animal protein correlates with increased risk for disease. So we don't have any adaptations to consuming animal protein at all.
You mentioned dairy, and I know you've talked sort of passionately about this, but what's your take on this substance?
Dairy is the most unnatural foods that human beings consume because dairy milk is meant to be consumed by baby mammals, and nowhere and in any form or fashion did nature ever intend that one species should be consuming the milk or mammary secretions of another species. And again, dairy foods have been shown to increase risk for breast cancer and also prostate cancer. And as an African American male, that's something that I am extremely concerned about because prostate cancer is much higher and much more prevalent in African Americans than it is Caucasian Americans. And once an African American male develops prostate cancer, he's more than twice as likely to die from it relative to his white counterparts. It's a much more deadly disease in us. And dairy foods are a primary risk factor for the development of prostate cancer. So they should absolutely be avoided. But it's also important for women to avoid dairy foods because milk is derived from pregnant cows, which means that these cows' systems and their milk are full of estrogens and other hormones that when women ingest them, increase their risk for hormone-related cancers as well.
So why does the US government recommend dairy then?
It's all marketing. They recommend dairy because the dairy lobby lobbies them to encourage it. But there's literally no physiologic reason, there's no scientific reason, because all of the research and that has been done on looking at the so-called benefits of consuming dairy have shown that dairy foods do not build stronger bones. In the Harvard Nurses Health Study, the women who ate the most dairy foods had the highest risk, or the women who drank the most milk had the highest risk of hip fracture. If you look worldwide, those nations that consume the most dairy foods also have the highest incidence of osteoporosis. So dairy foods have never been shown to protect one against anyone against osteoporosis. They've never been shown to help build stronger bones. So the idea that dairy foods are a good way to get your calcium is completely wrong. It is marketing. It's not science. And I've heard people say, well, milk has phosphorus and magnesium and other nutrients in it. And I tell them, drinking milk for the nutrients is like inhaling cigarette smoke for the oxygen. It's not a good idea.